He had turned a boy away for muddy shoes. He had fired a woman because the vase she dusted for him had tilted a fraction too far. The estate at Whitmore Hollow was a study in perfection. Clipped hedges, a pond that mirrored the sky, fountains that made music on command. From the glass of his study, Alexander Whitmore watched his world flow like a polished river beneath him. He owned the river. He owned the bridges that crossed it. He owned the men who maintained its banks. He even owned the doctors who had tried without success to fix what money could not. That morning, the gardener stood waiting with his hat in both hands, the dirt under his nails still dark. He had planted his life into those gardens for 18 years. Alexander's hand moved like the hinge of a trapdoor. "You left the row on the west border," Alexander said without looking up from the file in front of him. "You lost the pattern. You're careless. You're gone." The gardener blinked. He thanked him out of habit. He left with a limp that had nothing to do with his feet, and the dogs in the lane looked after him like cousins. The boy who carried the gardener's tools watched from the lane, close enough to hear the last syllables. That boy was Maya's neighbor's child. He would tell the story later in the village pub, half ashamed of his pleasure when a titan toppled. For now, the story had only one witness who mattered, a slight figure at the gate, crooked backpack on one shoulder, dust catching like a halo in the low sun. Maya had come to the estate because she could not do nothing. She had heard the rumor, there are always rumors, rich men are magnets for them, about a man who had bought every remedy money could find and still could not stand. She had come because in the hospital she had learned how thin the line between despair and stubborn hope could be. She had learned to sit, to hold, to ask a body to remember. They let her in because Alexander liked novelties that confirmed his power. Security scanned her. Margaret recorded her name with an eyebrow arched like an accusation. James, the head of security, was a mountain in a uniform. He had a neutral face until someone tried to turn the estate into a circus. He did not say yes or no. He simply opened the gate. She walked through the valley of clipped hedges toward the house as if it were any street she had walked 1,000 times. She smelled citrus trees and diesel and a faint metallic tang from the hallways, old money and newer machines. When she reached the threshold of his office, she could see him immediately, small, precise, a man who had been reduced to the circumference of his will. Alexander Whitmore had the kind of face that refused apology, the kind of jaw that was sold to the boardroom and learned to command obedience from the room itself. He looked up. His eyes were a cool, veteran blue. He happened to be particularly cruel that morning. Perhaps cruelty is one of the currencies wealth never exhausts. "So that's her?" he asked, voice like ice, sheathed in velvet. "She says she can help, Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said, and the word "says" had the faint weight of a judge before a sentence. Margaret had been with him since his father's funeral. She knew Alexander as the boy who loved to race the stable hands. She had also watched him gather into himself the years that hardened into this present. Alexander laughed, a short thing that left no warmth. He loved to watch the theatrical. He liked to see hope stripped down until it was obvious it could be purchased. "Bring her in," he said. "I want to see the face of whatever faith they're selling nowadays." Maya stepped into the room and felt the air shift. The diplomas on the wall gleamed like medals earned for the war against frailty, plaques from universities, framed certificates from clinics with names whose syllables cost a fortune. There were photographs of hospitals in Switzerland, of research centers with glass and alchemy. A bank of screens was set into a corner, glowing with stills from tests that had been performed on him. Pale X-rays, scans with little neon jokes. She did not flinch. Children who have watched a parent fight do not have the same startle reflex. They have a quiet center that measures risk and calculates whether action or waiting will save the person they love. Maya had once sat at her mother's bedside and watched her mother's hand go from warm to numb and back. Alexander watched her as if she were a specimen on the other side of a lens. "What makes you think you can do anything for me?" he asked. "Do you have a degree, a license, a certificate with paper and ink?" Maya looked at the diplomas, then at the scanner images on the screen. She saw power made into trophies, at once impressive and insufficient. She saw a man who had bought everything that could be bought to avoid being small. She saw a boy at the gate holding a tool he had no right to own. She answered in a voice that was plain and steady. "I don't have certificates that hang on a wall," she said. "I have a memory. I have a way of asking the body to remember itself." There was a pause, the kind of pause that felt to some like the hinge slipping and to others like a trapdoor opening. Alexander's mouth tightened. He loved to humiliate because humiliation proved him right. He enjoyed revealing the absurdities people brought to his table. He decided to humiliate her in a way that would be remembered. "If you cure me, I'll adopt you," he said, mocking as if the absurdity of the offer were part of the joke. He leaned back and let the cameras in his head roll. Maya tilted her chin a fraction. There was a flicker of something, confidence that had found dirt and learned patience. "Prepare the papers," she replied. The sentence folded the room into a new geometry. Everyone who had been counting on the artifice of power to keep order, even Margaret, even James, noticed that Alexander's laugh caught in his throat. He had not expected to be turned into the object of a wager. He had expected perhaps applause. He had expected theatrical failure. He had not expected to be told in 3 small words that if she succeeded, she would claim him as kin. He grinned in a way that was almost ferocious. "Very funny," he said. "Bring her to the clinic. Put sensors on her. We will record everything. If she tries anything—" "Everything will be recorded," Maya interrupted, "if only to show that consent was not a luxury she would surrender. But I don't want it to be a show. I want to sit with you. I want you to try." And there the wager lay. Not money, not a headline, but a contract of relationship, awkward and simple and dangerous. Adopted or no, the meaning of the exchange changed the terms. For Alexander, anything that could not be purchased had its own threat. If this story is speaking to you, a like helps others find it. They arranged the parameters as he liked them. There would be documentation. Dr. Peterson, who had overseen Alexander's care for years, came to the estate with the same precise gentleness he used to check pulses. He had the calm, professional look of someone who had learned to show up for impossible things. He was neither skeptic nor zealot. He treated each case as a question that required both humility and method. "Document everything," Alexander said to James. "No surprises." Dr. Peterson's hands were steady as he stuck soft electrodes to Alexander's skin. He explained what the sensors would show in the clinically clear voice of someone who believed measurement could keep wonder honest. Margaret took notes. The screens warmed like watchful eyes. Maya watched them arrange the stage and did not look away. She had learned young that people dressed despair in sterile clothing. Hospitals have a way of making grief orderly. She had also learned that order does not equal finality. "Where did you learn this?" Alexander asked on the first day of their arrangement. He was in his chair, but his voice had the brittle edge of a man who had ruled rooms for decades. "With my mother," Maya said. "When the doctors told us there was nothing more to try, she still asked me to talk to her hand like it was a person. She asked me to tell it stories about walking. I would trace the lines on her palm and say the names of streets as if she had been there. She would squeeze her fingers. Then she stood up." Alexander's laugh did not hide the flash of contempt. "So a bedtime story fixed a spine." "It wasn't a story exactly," she said. "It was remembering. When things are hurt, sometimes what's needed is to be noticed again." He rolled that word in his mouth as if testing its texture. Noticed. It had not crossed his mind in years that he, of all people, wanted something as simple as being seen. not for his assets, but for the man who could no longer run. They began with small gestures because that was all she would be allowed. Cameras watched every inch. Experts hovered. Alexander wanted to control the parameters. He wanted to prove that if there were a miracle, it could be shown to be injectable and repeatable with the right product and the right billing. He had not yet reckoned with the stubbornness of a child's conviction. The first session took place in his private therapy room, a glass cube that was both sanctum and prison. He sat in his chair and watched Maya set a small stool beside him. She moved deliberately, choosing stillness over dramatics. Dr. Peterson bowed his head over a tablet and said nothing. He had been instructed to document, but not intervene. Maya placed her hand, palm down, on his shin. It was a touch that acknowledged rather than commanded. She spoke in a low voice, reciting images that had anchored her mother, a dirt road in summer, the way shoes leave memory in dust. She asked him to place his attention not on the machine, but on the places that had once been ordinary. She asked him to find a name for the gravel under his feet. She asked if he remembered the sound of a neighbor's radio. Alexander sneered. "This is ridiculous." "It is a practice," she said. "We call it remembering. You can refuse it, you can turn up the screens, but remember that the memories are not in the diplomas on your wall. They're in your body." At first, it was all verbal. Maya described the tick of a clock from a place he'd once walked, an old alley where someone had taught him to tie laces. She asked him to watch his foot, as if seeing it might be the first step toward feeling it. The cameras recorded the lines in his face as something wavered. A muscle twitched like a thought. That twitch was small, like a moth beating against glass. But it was proof that beneath the armor of paralysis, the body kept a memory of motion. "You felt that," Maya said softly. "You felt something." "It was a spasm," Alexander said, "a random nerve misfiring." "Maybe," she answered. "Maybe it was. Or maybe it's the first conversation a leg has had with a hand in 5 years." He dug his nails into the arms of his chair. Details of the accident that had put him here came like photographs on a broken projector. A slick road, an impact, silver metal folding like paper. He remembered the immediate, brutal technicalities. The paramedics, the sterile lights, the verdict delivered in medical tones. He remembered, too, quieter things, how it felt to be carried by men who thought they knew him without ever asking. The grief in that memory was not only for his body. It was also for the currency of his life, access, command, the sense that will could shape a world. For all his money, for all the tests and experimental trials, what had been missing was not a lab. It was a witness. Maya's hands did not promise a miracle. They promised attention. Attention is a form of generosity most millionaires never get to practice. Days slipped into a pattern. Alexander insisted on monitors and logs. He demanded control over the hours when the sessions would happen. He watched the graphs of muscle potentials like a man counting stock. And in those graphs, under the sterile lines, something else was happening, a slow warming, a lengthening of attention that had once been trained only on profit margins and portfolio shifts. Margaret watched him in the early mornings when he had not yet taught himself to be cruel. He had been different once, she told herself in private. She remembered him laughing with a child, the time he had given his horse a blanket. The man in the chair now had a different vocabulary, contracts, lawsuits, leverage, but when the tremor came, she felt a familiar shock that cut like an old photograph. It was as if the man who had loved horses and mischief had been compressed into success until the compression began to crack. If the sessions had been a play, the staff would have called it catharsis. If they were a medical trial, the monitors would have called it noise. For Alexander, they were unbearable and electric in equal measure. He learned the ache of hope. He had not expected the ache to be so acute. Between sessions, he retreated to the study that had been both throne and tomb. He walked circuits of his memory, bookshelves that once held his father's annotated ledgers, framed photographs from a life that had been carefully curated. One frame held a picture of a little boy on a beach, wind-blown and laughing, and once he had been that boy. He had once been vulnerable enough to be saved. Maya's life, meanwhile, was a map of small economies. Her mother, Anna, had been a seamstress who mended for the church and sometimes mended for money. The scar tissue on Anna's hands had stories in it. When doctors had last told them there was little to do, there is always a cost to being poor, and sometimes the cost is the language used at the foot of the bed. Maya had refused to accept the finality as the only truth. She had taught herself the language of memory because it was free and because it worked sometimes, in ways that doctors noted discreetly and couldn't always explain. She did not tell Alexander about her mother, not at first. She spoke of small things, names of streets, smells, the cadence of a market. She taught him to pace his own breath like a metronome. She asked him to think of a door he had once opened, then imagine the creak of the hinge. She asked him to reach for it in his mind. Weeks passed. The cameras recorded an unsteady choreography of progress. A toe that would not respond suddenly curled like someone greeting a long-lost friend. A calf muscle tightened. Alexander's face, which had been practiced into indifference, began to betray fissures. His arrogance waned because it had to. The man who had ruled through reminders of scarcity now felt scarcity in himself. He missed walking down the lane without thought, the ease of a step that had been his since he had learned to run. Doctors cautioned. They called moments of movement inconclusive until they could be put under the loud, authoritative word reproducible. Dr. Pedersen kept his notes neutral, clinical, but he also started leaving the office late, hands folded, thinking of what the monitors caught in the silence between tests. Word traveled in careful, measured rumors from the estate. Men who dug the ponds saw Alexander walk alongside his chair with the help of a cane and felt something unfamiliar, the sense that a life could change and change the world around it. Like a pebble dropped into a still pond. The fired gardener found his name written on a check and could not believe the ink was for him. Maya herself had nights when doubt shook her. It was one thing to have a memory tattooed into a hand. It was another to keep steady under the glare of cameras and the skepticism of one of the richest men in the country. She would sit on her mattress and press her thumb into the ridge of her palm and remember the tremor that had once come to her mother, and she would find the small courage to go back. At times, Alexander lashed out. The thing that frightened him most was not the possibility of failure, but the possibility of being changed by something he had not purchased. He lashed at the caretakers for small, pathetic things. A cup of coffee not poured exactly as it should be, a voice too loud in the corridor. He made expensive people excuses for cruel acts and called it standards. But there were cracks. A nurse who had been with him the longest, someone who had once mocked his softer days, saw him shed tears in the night and did not report it. She packed a bag for the gardener's child and left it at Margaret's desk. Then came a session that bent the narrative in a way that no one at the estate expected. Maya had asked for a change, no monitors for an hour. Alexander demanded them. She agreed to have sensors placed, but asked that they not be turned on until the last minute. The request made Alexander laugh, but he consented because he liked to be the arbiter of conditions. That afternoon, the light was a slow, golden thing that pooled in the therapy room. It made the little hairs on Alexander's arm look like fields. Maya sat closer than usual. She put one hand on his knee and one on his lower leg, as if to marshal the attention of the limb. She asked him to think of a street from childhood. He named one, a lane where his brother had taught him to hop stones, and his voice fractured like cracked glass. She asked him to remember the smell of rain on hot asphalt. She asked him to imagine the mechanics of a step, not as a subject of theory, but as an old friend. "Talk to your legs," she said. "Say their names. Ask them to come home." The phrase was simple and not new, but inside those simple words was a permission Alexander had not given himself in years. Permission to be small. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to speak to his own body in the voice of a stranger asking for directions back home. He spoke a name to his calf. He whispered the name of a street to his toes. There was a sound like a match struck in the room. A small, ugly, beautiful sound, a muscle caught and let go. Alexander swore softly. Dr. Peterson leaned forward, tablet forgotten. The monitors, when they were turned on minutes later, registered a soft elevation in activity, a spike that mapped like a tiny mountain on a long, flat plain. "It could be an involuntary contraction," Dr. Peterson said. His voice was careful, but there was an undercurrent of wonder that made his professional mask waver. "Maybe," Maya said. "Or maybe it's the first letter of a sentence your body has been trying to speak." Alexander stared at the floor. Inside him, the conversation began. Disbelief tugged against something else. A shame he had been too proud to name. He had spent 5 years building walls. In the gap between them, emotion came through like a thin light. He had not expected tenderness to be part of a medical profile. News of the small mountain on the monitors leaked like raw sugar into the estate. Staff whispered in the kitchens. The gardener's son came by to watch from the hedge and fancied himself part of the miracle. The press, when it arrived in careful whisperings months later, would call this the moment the billionaire's pride began to fall away. For now, it was a place where several lives converged on a single small motion. That night Alexander walked alone in the conservatory with the cane he had been forced to touch in practice. He did not need to walk. He needed to stand in a new relation to himself. The light from the lamps made the glass panes look like held breath. He pressed his hand to the rail and felt a tremor in his fingers that echoed the tremor in his leg. For all his possessions, he had not known how to be held accountable by humility. The cane made him aware of a dependency he had always thought beneath him. Maya, at her mother's bedside that night, sat on the thin mattress and told her mother about the day. "He named a street," she said. "He talked to his toes. He laughed, then he cried. He tried." Anna listened with the patient patience of a woman who had been loved through injury and learned how to come back because someone had refused to leave. She squeezed her daughter's hand and squeezed the air with it, and in the small pressure was an entire theology that needed no scripture. Faith can be a verb. It can be stubbornness. It can be the recitation of a place until place itself answers. Back at the estate, Alexander attempted to sleep and failed. He had ordered the best beds, the softest linen, the exact temperature. Nothing settled the churning that came from a man learning to ask. He thought of examples of men who had resisted change and been swept away by it anyway. He thought of his father and the ledger that had taken precedence over laughter. He thought, with a child's clarity, of what it meant to walk without calculation. Outside, the world kept its mores. A fired gardener learned to mend fences for the council. A nurse, who had held his hand in the dark, found herself tenderer with her own child. The small tremor had moved like a rumor. It shifted how people treated each other because it suggested the possibility of human things surviving the crush of enterprise. Maya returned to sessions with a small, private satisfaction that was not hubris. She had not come to the estate for a trophy. She had come because she could not rest if she did not try. The wager had been a dangerous thing, but it had made visible the truth she had always trusted, that attention and memory can change how a body lives. Alexander continued to test her. He continued to demand data and proofs and to ask for trials. He watched the graphs like a man learning to read an unfamiliar language, the curves and spikes forming sentences he had never learned to pass. He tested her motives the way a stockbroker tests a broker's patience. He asked what she wanted, why she would risk her reputation on what she called remembering. "Why are you doing this?" he asked once. voice edged with both curiosity and a prick of jealousy he would not name. She looked at him as simply as she looked at a door that had been locked and now needed turning. "Because I remember," she said. "Because someone remembered me, because I can't turn away." He thought of one of the first gifts his father had given him, a carved little horse that from the lid had fallen into a box of childhood nonsense. He remembered the day he had broken it, and his father had laughed and told him he could glue it back together. He had never been taught to ask for gluing in the things that mattered most. As the sessions accumulated, so did small restitutions. A check arrived at the shabby flat of the gardener, whose wife had cried at the gate when she saw the man go. Alexander signed it with the economy of someone who had learned to make amends the way he made acquisitions, with a pen and a wielded authority. Margaret handled one of the letters and felt something like relief and grief at once. "He's not the same," she told James with a small voice. "Something's happening." "Probably strategically," James said, and then he softened. "He could be buying himself a conscience." "He could," she said, "or he might be learning how to carry a human weight." The estate's board of directors noticed small changes. Alexander began asking about benefits. He inquired about staff housing. The men who had once been afraid of his phone calls were confused, and in some cases grateful. This was the transformation that the rumor mills would later attribute to a conversion. For now it was raw and unprocessed, and dangerously close to being sincere. In a moment that would later be called a turning point, Alexander visited a small village hospital on a wet afternoon. He had not planned to, but the thought of a child who might need help had been lodged in his mind since Maya had told him about her mother. The hospital hallway smelled of bleach and fresh linen and low-voiced prayers. He moved slowly, cane tapping like a metronome. He did not announce himself. He simply sat in a folding chair and watched. A little boy named Pedro, only 3, with a bandage at his scalp and a mother whose eyes carried oversight like a new badge, was led past him. The boy blinked at Alexander's cane and reached for it with curious hands. Alexander's face softened in public for the first time in years. He extended his hand, careful, like a man offering friendship across a gap. The mother was startled. "Mr. Whitmore," she stammered. "It'll be all right," he almost said, and the sentence trembled because he did not yet fully believe it. He sat for a long time, then signed a check behind Margaret's careful back, then arranged for a specialist to review the case on the estate's dime. The cameras would later catch his walk back to the car and play the footage in news cycles that loved to narrate surrender. For now, the movement felt private. He felt something in his calf that answered back. He had questions he didn't yet want to ask, and answers he was not sure he deserved. Weeks stretched in the pattern of repetition and wonder. The sessions continued. The twitching happened, then another, then a tremble that lasted for a breath longer. At night, Alexander sometimes sat in his study and placed a small paper horse into the palm of his hand, the same carved horse his father had given him that had been mended once long ago. He would run his thumb over the grain and feel a history of being small and then being made whole again. Maya taught him to use words that were not metrics. She taught him to say thank you, more like a practice than a reflex. She taught him to ask his body questions instead of issuing decrees. One afternoon, she asked him to think of the first time he had walked into a room and felt like an adult. He closed his eyes and remembered a teacher who had named his ambition and sent him off with a ledger and a handshake. He remembered learning the language of deals as a refuge from the messy business of feeling. He had replaced the messy with the calculable until his life had become a set of transactions. "What were you trying to buy with all that money?" she asked once, in the honesty of a child. He laughed, which was a brittle sound and a dangerous one at the same time. "Security," he said. "Control." She looked at him like someone calculating the angle of a puzzle piece. "You can't buy control over yourself," she said. You can only remember how to trust your own legs. He would later call that line ridiculous or profound, depending on which shadow he was in, but at the time it landed in his chest like a small stone. He crushed it with the heel of his shoe like an experiment, then felt the crack under the surface. The story did not move in a straight line. There were backward steps, and there were days of rage when Alexander lashed out at staff for the smallest failures. Pride is a resilient thing. It does not yield easily. He had to be argued out of vindictive gestures by the same people he'd once ruled without listening. He had to be shown, in small daily restitutions, what it meant to apologize. But there were changes, real ones. The gardener's family received housing assistance. Employees who had been dismissed without cause were rehired. A benefits package, once called an unnecessary expense by the board, was quietly put into motion. Alexander found himself defending the human side of the ledger like a man who had just discovered a new metric, the value of restored dignity. And yet the body, stubborn as it is, did not comply like a well-trained servant. Progress was peppered with regressions. The monitors sometimes spoke only static. Doctors called certain days unreliable. Alexander's wealth could not compel muscle to obey, and that was a humiliating lesson. Still, there were moments, little ones, where the old man in the photograph seemed to step forward. A cough, a smile that was not smoothed by calculation, a promise he kept. It was in the 37th day, during a session that had embodied all their small rituals, that something happened small enough to be believable and large enough to be dangerous. Alexander felt the weight shift on his foot with intention, not reflex, not a contraction, an intent. He told Maya, in a voice he hardly recognized as his own, about the sensation of ground beneath the sole. He described the memory of a stoop he had climbed at the old family home. Maya asked him to name the stoop. He named it. She asked him to imagine stepping down. He tried. The cane quivered under his weight. The room held its breath. Then, just for a heartbeat, his heel rose. No one in the room moved. The cameras registered the motion. Dr. Peterson did not yet call it tragedy or triumph. Margaret covered her mouth. James looked like a man ready to defend a castle, but unsure which way the enemy had decided to turn. Alexander's eyes filled with something untried. He felt like a man who had been given scale again and was not sure whether to measure his losses or his newfound capacity. He wanted to reject the moment as cheap, a trick, but the muscle had answered a call. The call had been made with a child's soft insistence. He had not stood. He had not walked. He had, for the first time in 5 years, moved with intention. That night, after Maya left and the room dimmed, Alexander sat with his cane and ran his thumb over the carved horse's flank. He was a man who had been taught to hold nothing by halves. The admission that his body might remember more than his charts permitted was not a confession he would name aloud. It was a private revolution. Outside, the estate breathed. In the village, the gardener's child told anyone who would listen that miracles happened in clipped hedges. In the hospital, Anna smoothed her daughter's hair and whispered, "You did good." In the conservatory, a cane leaned against a bench like the hint of a new life. And in the quiet of his study, Alexander wrote a list of things, names of people he had wronged, the hours he had wasted, the restorations he might make if his body answered the summons of memory. He did not yet trust the list. He did not yet know if the tremor would gather into walking, but for the first time since his accident, he considered what it meant to be humble without losing the person he had been, if, in fact, that person had been worth saving at all. He closed the ledger and left the lamp burning. He dreamed of staircases and street names and small feet. He dreamed of a child who had told him, blunt as a bell, to prepare the papers if he wanted to be hers. The next morning, a winter sun lit the hedges like silver blades. The estate hummed with business, and the more delicate business of what people call faith. Inside the therapy room, Maya tightened her braid and placed her hand on his knee. "Today," she said, "we try a little longer." Alexander looked up, and for the first time when he met her eyes, he did not have an immediate retort. He had a question. "Do you want this?" he asked, in a voice that shed some of its ash. "Yes," she said simply, "but it's not about wanting. It's about trying." He inhaled. He placed his hand over hers for just a moment, and the touch was a treaty. Not a sale, not a promise of payment, but an agreement to try together. The monitors hummed. The room readied for another session. Outside, a prune tree trembled in wind. Inside, the body waited for the next small revolution. They set the hour and the rules, and then broke them in the smallest, truthful ways. Sensors stayed in place because Alexander would have it so. Cameras trained on the session because the world had a taste for spectacle. But for the first quarter of that morning, they let the blinking lights pretend they were only background. Maya sat on her stool, braid coiled over her shoulder, and held the thinness of the room like something alive. "Longer," she said. He nodded. He had learned to take her directions less like orders and more like invitations. The invitation, this time, felt like a narrowing of the options he had always favored. Buy, control, transact. In the quiet between her words and his assent, he felt the old ledger of himself begin to cross out items he no longer wanted to be. They worked in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the calendars of the men who wrote wills and signed contracts. It had the slow logic of seasons. Maya asked him to picture the soles of his feet as maps. She asked him to tell her the names of streets he had not said in years. She described a puddle from childhood and asked him what his heel did when it hit the water. He tried to answer, and his voice, long practiced to command, came softer, more curious than he had permitted himself to be. After an hour, after a pattern of breath and memory and touch, something shifted. The cane became something he used as a counterweight rather than a prop. He felt weight moving through him in a way that wanted to be called intention, not reflex. He put one hand on the arm of his chair and then, as if testing an old hinge, he braced and rose a fraction. No one in the room announced it. The monitors hummed. A muscle under his knee tightened with a sound like a held note letting out. Margaret folded her hands and watched, like someone watching a candle bend toward a draught, both afraid and waiting for what would happen if the flame survived. James's stance loosened. Dr. Petterson's clinical face betrayed a small fissure of something he had not allowed himself at work. "Wonder. Hold," Maya said. Her voice had the steadiness of someone who had spent long nights naming streets to a hand that once belonged to someone who could walk. "Remember what it felt like, how you learned it, not what the books say." He remembered not the textbooks, but a warm sun on a stoop, the scrape of a shoelace against timber, the smell of grease from a deli his brother used to visit. He moved his foot with the care of someone learning how to balance wine on an old tray. It did not go far. It did not have to. It only had to be intentional. Intentionality multiplied faster than any ledger line. Small by small, week by week, muscle answers came more frequently. In the private architecture of Alexander's evenings, where solitude had once been a fortress, the tremors left a trail of possibility. He found himself standing at windows he used to look through when he counted property lines, and instead of scheming new acquisitions, he started cataloguing the faces he had misplaced along the way. Stable hands, nurses, a gardener in work-worn boots. The garden crews noticed first. A foreman named Thomas, who had worked for the estate for 30 years and who had once been given a sack for overtime in coins instead of thanks, found his name on a letter that arrived with a stamped check and the words, "Rehire and annual salary adjustment." He stared at the envelope as if it were a grown thing he did not recognize. His wife cooked rice that week with more oil than usual. Margaret, who had kept his calendar and sometimes his conscience, watched the shifts like a woman reading the weather. She had been the first to see him as a small boy who loved horses and who once knelt mud-streaked after a fall with a laugh that made the world safe for a minute. She had matured into a woman who had learned how to keep secrets and how to carry burdens without asking for credit. When Alexander approached her one afternoon with a tremor in his voice and the question of what the estate could do for its people, she almost laughed with relief. "Health insurance for all hourly staff," he said. The words came out like a note struck loud after years of silence. "We will fund education grants. We will examine housing." She watched him and then, with the small exactness of someone who had managed ledgers for 40 years, wrote down names of people he had wronged, the hours he owed, the promises he would have to make to mean anything by them. Not all of the estate's board believed it was sincere. There were memos and meeting rooms where men in suits raised eyebrows and calculated the optics. Reputation management, one advisor suggested. They debated percentages and tax treatments as if conscience arrived in balance sheets. Alexander sat through those conversations, like a student refusing to be insulated by the comfortable logic of arithmetic. Sometimes he still argued in the old language. Sometimes he listened. When he listened, something in him creaked open, like an old hinge finally freed of paint. Press interest followed the small movements like ravens following a plough. There were op-eds that called it the billionaire's vanity, an exercise in spectacle. There were commentators who called Maya a con artist. Dr. Peterson, who in his professional training valued replicability and peer review, started getting calls from colleagues who wanted to see the graphs. He met them with a cautiousness that was almost filial. He kept his notes meticulous and did not allow his hope to make him reckless. "Don't let public adulation create pressure," he told Alexander once, when the subject of an interview had come up. "We can speak to process, we can speak to ethics, but we should not make promises we cannot vet." Alexander surprised him by nodding. "I don't want to promise anything to the public," he said. "I want to promise restitution to people." That line, restitution, became the engine of something more durable than headlines. Alexander convened a small group: Margaret, Dr. Peterson, James, and to everyone's surprise, Maya. He asked the questions he had never asked before. Who did we let go? Who should be paid? Who needs counsel? He spoke about a fund he would seed to support families who had been told there was nothing left to do. "It can be called whatever the board likes," he said to Margaret, and then, without theatrics, "but it should be run by people who actually listen." They named it Whitmore Remembering Fund, a name that carried both a public health of humility and a hint that memory in this story would be valued as medicine of another kind. The legal work began: consultants, charitable registries, bylaws. There were tedious hours where Alexander sat with lawyers who spoke in syllables that had once soothed him into confidence. He found those hours smaller, somehow more honest, than the boardrooms in which he had previously dominated conversation. Meanwhile, the sessions continued and escalated in ways that were less theatrical and more granular. Those who observed the narrative from a distance called it therapy. Those who sat inside called it work. Maya guided him not with recipes, but with prompts. Name a chair in your grandmother's house, smell a pan of frying onions, hum a children's song his mother used to hum when he was ill. In those small prompts, his memory returned with the slowness of water soaking into soil. For Maya, the work had costs. Nights were finished in a cheap room in town where her mother, Anna, mended fabric and talked about stitches, as if sometimes they were prayers. There were hidden receipts she could not always explain, days when she turned down offers to speak to cameras and returned home tired and plain. She had learned to be invisible because it kept others safe. She had learned to be visible because some things demanded it. Once after a session where Alexander had cried in a way she had never seen a man of his size cry, silent, breaking tears that tasted like an old grief, she walked home past the grocery, named for a family that had been in the village for generations. A woman in the doorway, who recognized her from the clinic, pressed a sandwich into Maya's hands and said, "You don't owe us an explanation." Maya accepted it, and then walked faster, lest the gesture feel like charity. The public story thickened when Alexander, who had never given an interview without scripting every sentence, agreed to sit across from a journalist who had been invited by Dr. Peterson to take a balanced view. The journalist wanted spectacle. Alexander offered honesty. "I'm not a convert to any miracle," he said during the interview, defiantly careful. "I do not have a formula. I have learned something about how I treat people and how I treat myself. That is what matters." "Is it faith?" the journalist asked. "It's human relation," Alexander said. "Attention and humility. Those are not religions. They are practices." The piece ran with a headline that baffled both his PR team and the tabloids: "The Billionaire Who Decided to Remember." It did not explain Maya's methods. It did not need to. The public wanted a secret recipe, and instead the feature offered a portrait of a man who had admitted he had misused his power. At the hospital, the work continued in parallel. Pedro's case, the child who had once reached for Alexander's cane in a corridor, did not resolve like a chapter in a book. He had suffered a head injury, and his recovery had been cautious. Surgeons had done what surgeons could do. Therapies had been scheduled. Hope had been measured in millimeters. When Alexander visited with donations that funded a more intensive review of Pedro's rehabilitation plan, Dr. Sarah Chen, a pediatrician who had been patient and skeptical in equal measures, insisted on proper protocol. "We are not trading spectacles for science here," she told the team when Alexander proposed a small week of additional relational therapies curated by Maya. "We will do our due diligence." They did. The hospital scheduled additional occupational therapy, imaging and monitoring. Maya did not enter with dogma. She sat by Pedro's bed and asked him to name his favorite dinosaur, then told him a story about a hero who learned to hop over puddles. She did things that could not be measured easily. She let his mother speak, and she listened to what the mother feared and hoped for. She held the child's hand in a way that refused to commodify his body. If anything, the hospital team learned that listening for a family's story sometimes loosened the rigidity around a child's regime and allowed for tiny, if unpredictable, gains. After a weeks that were long to the mother, comprised of laundry and waiting and whispered prayers, Pedro's occupational therapist reported a small but meaningful change, an increased willingness to bear weight for a few seconds. It was not a miraculous cure, and none of the clinicians called it such. They called it an encouraging sign and adjusted his plan. At a later press conference, Dr. Chen described the week with measured hope. "This is part of a wider approach that includes standard rehabilitation protocols," she said. "We cannot conclude causality from 1 week, but we can acknowledge that relational interventions can play a role in a child's willingness to engage." Alexander, when asked by reporters why he had chosen to fund the review, answered simply, "Because I can. Because my fortune shouldn't fence people out of possible efforts. Because some things are moral obligations, not investments." In the estate's conversion from fortress to a place with several open doors, there were symbolic actions and there were practical ones. A retired gardener was rehired. A nurse who had been overworked received a paid month of leave to restore. A fund was set to pay for counseling for families who could not afford it elsewhere. Alexander signed checks quietly and walked with his cane to the small housing units built near the service roads to meet the electricians and carpenters who had once labored for pennies. He listened to their stories in a way he had previously merely catalogued. He offered apologies that were imperfect, and then, because he could no longer be satisfied by the form of apology alone, he backed them with policy. The transformation unsettled the estate's culture. Men used to being barked at softened. Some left because they could not reconcile themselves to the change. Others stayed because they had been offered not only employment, but respect. The gardener's wife, who had once spoken of leaving for the city and finding work in a laundromat, now found a path to apprenticeship work paid by the fund. Her sons learned they had a future that did not require them to leave. Through all of this, Maya remained a child. Reporters sometimes tried to pin her down for quotes. Camera crews offered money for a story she did not want to sell. She refused. She would make a single comment in public, always about attention, always about remembrance, and then she would go home to the room where Anna sat surrounded by bolts of fabric and days that had to be counted in frayed threads. And yet the story's hinge remained the body. The weeks ripened into months. Alexander's balance improved. He practiced falling like someone learning to ride a bicycle. He practiced getting up with a method that was more patience than force. Once, in an unscripted moment when the store of embarrassment that most men of his station carried caught him off guard, he stumbled and then laughed, a sound so raw that it made Dr. Peterson, who had seen him in every kind of pain, feel tears. Then on a spring afternoon, when the garden magnolias were beaded with pale flowers and the air smelled like wet earth, Maya asked for an experiment that was small in its request and enormous in its consequences. She wanted no cameras. She wanted no monitors. She wanted only the estate's old stone path, a cane and a narrow audience, Margaret, James, Dr. Peterson, and a foreman who had been told to keep the world at the gate. Alexander agreed. He had learned to refuse spectacle, but he had also learned to trust a small circle of witnesses. He sat at the edge of the stone path, cane at his side. Maya stood opposite him, barefoot in the grass, looking at him as if she were waiting for a friend to return. "Count with me," she said. "Not numbers, memories, stones in the path. Say them aloud." He set his mouth and did as she asked. They named cobbles and petals, and a boy who used to race along that very path with a dog on his heels. He took the cane and placed his weight, slow as a confession, onto his feet. They were heavy with history and surprisingly alive. He rose, not without effort, not without the world bearing down on the possibility of collapse. But he rose. The garden held its breath. Birds landed in the hedges and sang, as if not wanting to miss what sounded like a small, private redemption. Alexander's legs held him, tremulous and fearful and true. For a step he swayed, then found an axis and put weight through his heel. Then another step, then a third. Maya walked beside him like a child leading an old dog home, her hand hovering an inch from his elbow, ready to steady, not to seize. When he walked across that path, it did not happen like lightning. It happened like a tide coming in slowly and then claiming a shore. He did not stride. He made steps that bore the dignity of someone relearning how to be in a body. Margaret, who had kept so many of his files, wept with surprise. James, who had once guarded the property with a severity that brooked no nonsense, wiped his eye like a man catching himself in a private act of mercy. There were no shouts of triumph. Maya reached into her pocket and handed him a scrap of paper, an old receipt from the village market, where he had once bought a wooden horse as a child. "Keep it," she said, "so you remember what a small thing feels like." He carried that scrap in his jacket for many months. He would later place it in the same drawer with the carved horse. He kept the paper because memory needed objects as anchors. But the larger thing he kept was the knowledge that the world could not be reduced to what he could purchase. Word of the walk leaked. Someone had seen them through a hedge. Someone had remarked to a friend. The press circled like sharks. Photographers waited at the gate for images that would sell. A journalist wrote a piece that tried to reconcile his old life of acquisitions with this new, vulnerable man who walked with a cane and a private smile. Alexander chose again to speak simply. "I'm allowed to be small," he told an interviewer. "I have been sovereign over other lives for decades. Now it's my turn to be under care." The rest of the story did not end with that afternoon. Standing and walking were milestones, not destinations. They were the first pages of a ledger that would be rewritten. There were falls, literal and figurative. There were days when pain reasserted itself and the monitors recorded static. There were boardroom arguments about budgets and whether certain programs were sustainable. There were nights, too, when Maya sat behind the wheel of her small car and drove to the hospital to be with Anna as stitches were sewn into a new garment. What did change, in a durable way, was the moral center of the estate. People who had once been disposable suddenly had advocates. Alexander used his strength, now tempered by vulnerability, to push for policy changes across the companies he controlled. He insisted on living wage increases, on paid leave for caregivers, on a program that placed counselors in hospitals who could sit with families in the way Maya had sat. A presence that did not solve everything but refused to let people be forgotten. One notable outcome of the Whitmore Remembering Fund was a legal clinic that aided families facing unsympathetic insurers. A former employee, fired in haste years before, was rehired and given a leadership position supervising community outreach. He was, by temperament, a man who had hardened after years of being dismissed. When he stood at a community meeting and spoke of thanks, his voice trembled. He said, "We were forgotten until someone decided we shouldn't be." The hospital, too, saw modest but meaningful outcomes. Pedro progressed in ways that doctors hedged with careful language. He began to play, then to bear weight more reliably, then to run a little on a surface of support. His mother wrote a letter to Margaret, to Dr. Peterson, to the fund, and to Maya. The letter did not mention miracles. It mentioned nights when the child had wanted to get up and do it, and a team that helped him want to try. The letter was framed in the hospital corridor like proof that insurance policy and human attention can coexist. As their efforts became more formal, Alexander wrestled with publicity. He was wary of being called a savior or a spectacle. He refused offers from networks to dramatize his sessions for ratings. He declined a lucrative book deal that would have made his story into a formula. Instead, with Dr. Peterson and Margaret's counsel, he set up a small council to oversee the fund and its priorities, professional people, social workers, long-time staff, and gave them control. He wanted the work to stand on practices and on humility, rather than on one person's redemption arc made into entertainment. Maya watched all of this in a way she rarely made public. She attended meetings sometimes, only when she felt the work needed her perspective. She refused honorary chairs and gala speeches. She wanted simply for people to be learned in the language of attention. She still taught the same small practices in hospitals and in a room that the fund sponsored for people who needed a quiet, non-clinical place to talk. In a town more accustomed to gossip than policy, neighbors debated the extent of Alexander's sincerity. Editorials wrestled with the tension between redemption stories and the structural forces that produce suffering. Some asked whether wealth's repentance can ever be enough. Alexander, who had once thought so in the abstract, now sat in meetings where he had to prove his generosity through budgets and through time. He also discovered that repentance is not a single line item. It is a process. He had to ask forgiveness and then accept that apology might not be enough for some. He had to create programs that had oversight and metrics and, importantly, the input of people who would be affected. He learned to read the reports that suggested which neighborhoods needed more help, and then he walked those streets himself, unannounced and untidy. At home, he continued to learn how to be a man who had been loved badly and who wanted to do better. He wrote letters, restitution notes, to individuals he had wronged, some petty and some grievous. He did not expect them to accept. He did not expect absolution. For a man used to getting what he needed, learning to live with the consequences of unkindness was perhaps the greatest lesson. One afternoon, months after the walk across the stone path, Maya came to the estate with a small group of children from the hospital. Pedro among them, unbandaged and curious, his hair a nest that had grown back with stubborn vitality. They had come to plant a small wildflower patch in a neglected corner, a project the fund funded. Alexander watched them with a quiet that had nothing to do with the old baritone of command. He got down from his chair and, with the careful help of a cane, bent to plant seeds. "You don't need me to do this," Maya told him, smiling. "No," he said, "but I want to." She looked at him for a moment, at the way his hands trembled but did not stop, and then she stepped closer and took his elbow. "Then let's do it together." News outlets noticed these smaller scenes and ran them with different tones. The tabloids tried to make football of the contradictions. The more sober pieces began to ask whether high-visibility philanthropy could change institutions. Alexander's answer was to ask for accountability. If he used his wealth to open doors, he wanted the doors to open genuinely, not theatrically. As the fund matured, they held a community meeting in a local hall where people could voice requests and grievances. It was raw and at times electric. Alexander sat in the back, no stage, no microphone, and listened. A woman who had once been his cleaner recounted the indignity of an unpaid sick day and asked for a policy change. A teenager asked for after-school programs. A man who had been dismissed years before came forward and asked for training and reinstatement. Alexander did not answer every question with cash. He promised to fund programs and to set up a panel, and then he stayed to help the panel write its first charter. "Maya and I began with something called remembering," he once said in a town hall. "We asked questions nobody had asked. We sought to notice what had been ignored. That is not enough, but it is direction." He kept private his strongest debt to Maya, the memory that had allowed him to face the smallness he had avoided. He did not use her as a poster child. He did not make her into an emblem. She remained in his life and the fund's policy, a presence and a boundary. Years later, when the fund had been operating long enough to present annual reports and case studies, a journalist asked him if he had fulfilled the wager he'd made in the office the day they first met. "If you cure me, I'll adopt you," he had said then, and she had said, "Prepare the papers." He smiled at the memory of the line like someone remembering a child's joke. "She told me to prepare the papers," he said. "I prepared other papers. I wrote policies. I wrote checks. I wrote apologies. I don't know if adoption is the right legal form. I'm not the kind of person who can be a ward, but she taught me to be claimed in a better way, by responsibility." Maya, hearing the interview, allowed herself a small grin. She remained a child with a fierce sense of what was right and not given to theatrics. Once, when Alexander offered publicly to fund her schooling and more, she accepted the scholarship but refused the spotlight. "School is not a stage," she told him. "It's a place to be better." And so the story folded into a new life. Alexander walked more often, with careful steps and the occasional cane. Sometimes he sat in his wheelchair to attend meetings because he appreciated the perspective it gave him. He often walked the stone path without cameras. He kept the carved horse and the scrap of market receipt in a drawer by his bedside. He kept his hand in his jacket as if to check he still had what he needed, a memory, fresh and enforceable, of the small kindnesses that made life livable. Maya continued to visit hospitals. She continued to teach memory practices in quiet spaces created by the fund, always with the caveat that she was not a doctor, not a miracle worker, merely a person who knew how to listen and how to ask a body to remember what it once did. Dr. Peterson and Dr. Sarah Chen included her work as a complementary practice, neither medical nor dismissive, but integrated with rehabilitation where appropriate. They never offered a guarantee. They offered measured hope and accountability. Years later, when Alexander walked without a cane for a short stretch on a winter morning, he paused by the pond that mirrored the sky and watched a boy skip a stone. The boy's mother called him from the bank. He looked at the water and thought about how he had owned bridges and rivers and everything, and yet it had been attention, not acquisition, that restored his balance. Margaret had retired to a cottage in a nearby town and visited sometimes. She kept a photograph of Maya and Alexander planting wildflowers, an odd couple, the woman in a dress too big for a child, and the man in a suit trying not to soil himself with gardening soil. He sent her letters that were more frequent than his former habits would have suggested. Small confessions, sometimes an apology, sometimes a note saying what the garden smelled like after rain. On the day the Whitmore Remembering Fund celebrated its 5th year, they held a low-key event at the estate for the families who had benefited. There were speeches and small testimonials. Pedro's mother read a short paragraph about the dignity they had been afforded, and then Alexander stepped up to speak. He did not speak of miracles or of self-redemption performed cleanly. He spoke of mistakes and of obligations and of the way that a child's voice once told him to prepare the papers, and in doing so taught him a different kind of legal document, a pledge to remember. "I cannot promise cure," he said. "I can promise work. I can promise money, which is a tool, but more than that, I can promise to put my name to programs that keep asking the hard questions. That is what I owe." He sat down afterwards, and Maya, who had refused the limelight but had been persuaded to attend by her mother, came to where he was seated. She wiped a bit of soil off his sleeve with a napkin and smiled in a way that was not grandiose, but utterly direct. "You kept your side of the wager," she said. He laughed softly. "I had no idea what the wager meant when I threw it out like a coin," he said. "I thought it was a joke, but you were asking me to be a better man. That's costlier than most of the checks I've written." "I didn't take you literally," she said. "I wanted someone who would care." He took her small hand in his, a gesture he had learned to do without dominating, and he held it for a moment as if acknowledging ownership in an ancient and reversed sense. He belonged now not to his assets, but to the responsibility he'd chosen. When the evening wound down, and the children had run off to throw seed bombs into the newly planted patch, he walked through the estate at a slow, private pace. He paused on the bridge that overlooked the pond, where he had once measured out his life in acres. He thought of his father and the ledgers, and the man who had been natural at command and yet flawed when it came to tenderness. He thought finally of what Maya had taught him in fewer words than any of his executives could pass. Childhood is not merely a stage of life, it's a lens for truth. A child's straightforwardness had cut through decades of armor. There were still days when he sat with a ledger, calculating budgets and planning programs. There were still nights he woke with the old panic and the old urge to control. But he had learned to put that urge against a backstop of humility, to ask others to call him out, to invite Margaret and James, to tell him when he slipped, to sit in meetings where he did not dominate the agenda. Maya grew. She finished school with a scholarship that the fund underwrote. She studied fields nobody had imagined when she first arrived at Whitmore Hollow, a mix of social work and literature, and brought both disciplines to bear on her quiet practice. She continued to refuse fame. She published later on a small volume of stories about memory, not as instruction but as testimony to the ways bodies and lives remember one another. In his later years, Alexander could be seen walking the estate without announcing himself. Sometimes he would stop at the gate and speak to the gardener's grandson, who loved tools and had a bright, practical grin. Sometimes he would sit in the hospital's family room and listen to parents who had been told no more to try. He learned to live with the tension between money's capacity to do good and its inability to heal everything. He learned, too, that some wounds demanded time and presence more than currency. On a late autumn afternoon, when leaves had browned and the wind moved with an honest chill, he sat in the conservatory and drew a small breath. He had lived enough years to know that life would keep offering chances for repair, and he had learned to say yes to them more than he had said yes to the deals that had once dominated his life. He kept a drawer where the carved horse and the market receipt lay, and there he pinned a small note he had written once to himself, years earlier, marked by the honest hand of a man learning how to be small. Remember the barefoot child at the gate. Remember to be claimed. Maya visited sometimes, bringing her mother with a fresh patchwork coat. They would sit beneath the magnolias and look at the water and talk about small things. The way a child's laughter carried across a room, the sound of rain on tin, the odd smell of an old book. They did not talk about miracles. They talked about the things they could do with attention. If you came to Whitmore Hollow these days, you would not find a man who had been perfectly changed. You would find a man who lived with his failures and tried daily to make amends. You would find a fund that funded practical programs but did not pretend to have all the answers. You would find a woman who had refused spotlight and instead taught the rest of them how to listen. You would find a community that had been nudged toward a different set of priorities by one child's insistence. At the edge of the pond, Alexander would often pause and watch the water catch light. He had everything money could buy, and finally, something money couldn't: the practice of listening. He kept his hands busy, planting, signing checks, writing letters, because habit could be a gift if it was turned toward the things that mattered. When asked if he ever regretted being cruel in the past, he spoke plainly. "I regret that I thought power was a shield," he said. "I regret that it taught me to avoid asking for help. I regret that it made me small in a way I didn't understand." Maya, who had once been a child at the gate willing to sit with him in a therapy room, now sometimes called him "my adopted" in private when teasing friends. It was an old joke they kept between them, a way of naming the reversal of roles. The rich man who once owned everything had been claimed in the more intimate way, by responsibility, by care, by being required to remember. The final thing he taught them, and perhaps the most stubborn lesson, was this: that the deepest cure is not the fixing of a body alone, but the repairing of a heart and the reweaving of a life into a community that remembers its weakest members. He had walked back into the public orbit, not as a man seeking redemption to be polished in a profile, but as a man who understood that to have wealth was to have obligations as inevitable as time. Months later, on a day when the magnolias were beginning to bloom, Maya stood at the gate, backpack anodyne, and watched the road. A boy she had taught at the hospital ran past and called a greeting. She smiled, then looked up as Alexander walked through the gate without his cane, steady and deliberate. He saw her and lifted a hand, not in command but in greeting. She lifted her chin and, with the same plain certainty she had used on that first morning, called, "Prepare the papers." He laughed, then, not with the old cruelty, but with an openness that admitted he had been changed. "I have prepared other papers," he replied softly, and then, as if adding a small truth he had learned from her, "I will keep preparing them." If this story changed how you see hope, subscribe and tell us which part moved you most.